If power rested in your hands, would you realize when that power begins to destroy you? This is not a fairy tale. And it's not just a legend. This is a historical confrontation between a man chosen by the divine and a king who believed he was one. In the burning shadows of ancient Egypt, beneath the silent pyramids and the ever-flowing Nile, 10 terrifying plagues descended like the wrath of an unseen force. The waters turned to blood, the skies turned to darkness, and the firstborn, the last thread of hope, never woke again. But were these truly miracles, divine punishment, or merely nature reclaiming what mankind had taken? In this story, you won't just witness the collapse of an empire. You'll be forced to confront a question no one can escape. When the signs of disaster knock on your door, will you bow to truth or harden your heart until the end? The story of Moses and Pharaoh, when divinity confronts earthly power. Amid the golden sunlight of Egypt and the silver shimmer of the Nile, a proud kingdom rose to dominate the East. Pharaoh, the living embodiment of the gods, sat majestic upon his throne, ruling not only his people but also their very belief in divine order. Yet, in the shadows of the slave quarters, among the oppressed Hebrews, a quiet spark waited, one destined to ignite a storm. Moses was not born a liberator. He was a child cast adrift on the river, saved by Pharaoh's daughter and raised within the very palace of his people's oppressor. Raised between two worlds, royalty and bondage, Moses carried within him the dual legacy of power and longing for freedom. A fateful event drove him into the wilderness, where he encountered the voice of God through a burning bush that was never consumed. From that moment, his mission was clear: to lead his people out of slavery. Moses returned to Egypt not as a prince, but as a messenger of the Almighty. Standing before Pharaoh, once his brother, in the palace, he made a simple yet earth-shaking demand: "Let my people go." Pharaoh stared back with scorn and contempt. How could a desert wanderer dare command the king of Egypt? But Moses stood firm. He brought no armies, no weapons, only a staff and an unshakable faith in the power of the Lord. And so began a battle, not between warriors, but between man and divine will. Pharaoh, proud and unyielding, believed his power was eternal. Yet each denial he uttered summoned another plague. The Nile turned to blood, frogs swarmed into the royal bedchambers, insects devoured crops, darkness devoured daylight, and in the end, death crept silently into the homes of every firstborn. This was not merely a clash of two men. It was a collision between faith and arrogance, between the will of a downtrodden people and the might of an empire thought to be invincible. On the final night, enveloped in silence and sorrow, Pharaoh relented. He allowed Moses to lead his people out of Egypt into a vast and uncertain desert, a journey that was not only physical, but deeply spiritual. From that moment on, Moses was no longer a fugitive. He became a symbol of deliverance, a man who dared to challenge a kingdom, and won, by standing on the side of truth. Plague 1. The water turns to blood. The skies above Egypt were calm that day, as they always were: blazing sun, still air, and the Nile flowing peacefully as it had for thousands of years. But beneath the river's glassy surface, a warning, or perhaps a miracle, was waiting to rise. Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh once again. This time, they did not plead, they delivered a sign. Moses raised his staff, a simple wooden rod, now an instrument of divine power. He stretched it over the Nile, and as it touched the water, the familiar turquoise hue turned dark red, the color of blood, of wrath rising from the depths of the underworld. Fish floated lifeless to the surface, a foul, metallic stench crept into homes and temples alike. The Egyptians had no water to drink, even the jars drawn from deep wells ran crimson. The Nile, once revered as the god of life, now seemed like an angry spirit demanding tribute. Pharaoh raged, but beneath the anger was confusion. His sorcerers mimicked the miracle, turning bowls of water red with their tricks, yet they could not undo the devastation spreading through the land. And Moses stood firm. not as the cause, but as the voice of the will behind the plague. For 7 long days, the Nile remained blood. Egypt trembled. No one dared speak aloud, the fear rising in their hearts. This was only the beginning. Pharaoh remained defiant, and Moses, without sword or army, marched steadily toward the next test of divine power. Plague 2. Frogs overrun the land. As the Nile slowly returned to its familiar blue, the people of Egypt breathed a sigh of relief. They thought the nightmare had passed, but nature never recovers in silence. Something had shifted, and the life within the river had been thrown into chaos. They came from every damp corner. Frogs, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands, leaping from the riverbanks, from wells, from stagnant ponds, and damp crevices. At first, it was a few distant croaks in the night, but then, the sound became a cacophony of dread, drowning out wind and prayer alike. Frogs invaded Pharaoh's palace, leapt onto his bed, entered kitchens, climbed onto dinner tables. They covered the roads, jumped into water jars, pots of stew, even onto the faces of sleeping children. No space was safe, no place untouched. To the Egyptians, frogs were sacred, symbols of fertility and rebirth, but these were not bringers of blessing. They were an infestation, a divine message turned terror, a sacred sign twisted into a curse. For the first time, Pharaoh summoned Moses. "Pray to your God," he demanded, torn between rage and desperation. "Take the frogs away," Moses agreed, but reminded Pharaoh that freedom had a price. And so, Moses prayed. The frogs died, but their death did not bring peace, only the stench of decay. Piles of carcasses littered every step, every street. The warning had been delivered, but Pharaoh's heart, once again, hardened. The next plague was already waiting. Plague 4. The swarms of flies. In the days following the plague of frogs, Egypt was cloaked in eerie silence. The croaking had stopped, but in its place came another sound, faint at first, almost unnoticeable. A buzz. A soft, sinister hum that would soon consume a kingdom. No one knew where the flies came from. It was as if they were born from the very decay infecting the land, from the dead frogs, the stagnant waters, the stench still clinging to the thick desert heat. First, a few swirled around the market stalls, but then, they multiplied, like an airborne plague. The skies turned black with wings, blotting out the sun at midday. They clung to children's faces, crawled into the eyes of the elderly. They swarmed through homes, coated every surface, filled mouths and nostrils. People could not eat without brushing them away. They could not sleep without waking in panic. Every corner of every village reeked of rot and buzzing chaos. Even Pharaoh, the mighty god king of Egypt, found himself waving flies from his face on the throne. His sorcerers stood helpless now, their spells exhausted, their pride in tatters. Whatever deity Moses served, it was no longer distant, it was real, and it was furious. And Moses, calm, unyielding, once again repeated the same demand, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh, like a wounded beast, could not surrender. He wavered, then recoiled. And in that moment of defiance, the swarm did not recede. It merely prepared the way for what would come next. A new plague was already waiting in the wings. Plague 5. The death of livestock. For generations, the Egyptians had revered cattle, sacred symbols of prosperity, fertility, and divine favor. In every field, the lowing of oxen, the gentle thud of hooves, and the warmth of grazing animals marked the rhythm of life itself. But one morning, that rhythm ceased. This plague did not crash in like thunder. It came quietly, coldly, and with a deadly calm. The cattle that grazed strong the day before now lay still in the dirt. Their skin turned ashen, eyes frozen wide, last breaths dissolved into morning mist. sheep collapsed beside their newborns. Donkeys slumped mid-step, camels groaned and fell. It was as though a silent curse had swept through every pen, every pasture. Panic erupted in the countryside. Cries rang across the empty fields. There were no predators, no battle, no bloodshed, and yet, everything was dying. Herds dropped by the dozens, and with them fell Egypt's food, its pride, and its power. The flies had done their work. Tiny bites became gateways for infection. The disease spared no one, not Pharaoh's finest stallions, nor the poor man's only goat. Blood soaked into dry grass, the land of plenty was becoming a land of loss. And Moses stood silently. There was no need for drama now, no staff raised, no declaration made. He only looked upon Pharaoh, still seated on his throne, but now surrounded by the sound of nothing. Pharaoh clenched his fists, his pride, unyielding, would not crack. But behind his eyes, something was beginning to break. And the heavens were not done. The next blow was already forming in the dark. Plague 6. Boils and blisters. Pharaoh still would not yield. Though the pastures had gone silent and the cries of livestock no longer stirred the morning wind, he remained seated upon a throne overshadowed by a kingdom slowly rotting from within. But then came what no one expected. The plagues no longer struck rivers or fields, nor animals in their pens. Now, they came for the people themselves. The air shifted, a strange wind blew, hot, laced with the scent of ash and burning metal. Moses and Aaron, by command of the Lord, stepped forward and took ashes from the brick kilns, the same fires that once forged the suffering of Hebrew slaves. They threw the ashes into the sky, and that dust became a storm of affliction. By morning, red spots bloomed on the skin of Egyptians, small at first, then swelling, blistering, rupturing into open sores. A single touch burned like fire. From nobles to laborers, priests to peasants, none were spared. Those who once wore fine linen now wrapped themselves in rags, groaning in the corners of their homes. The palace became a hospital. The streets echoed with moans. The scent of decay now mingled with the stench of scorched human flesh, drifting into restless, fevered dreams. No one could stand tall for long. No one dared look in the mirror, for the mirror would reflect an Egypt disintegrating upon its own skin. The magicians, once proud to imitate the signs, could no longer stand. Their bodies too were covered in boils. They slumped in the shadows, unable to face Moses. And Moses said nothing, no warnings, no persuasion, only silence and judgment that crept forward, layer by layer, breath by breath. Pharaoh clenched his jaw. He would endure. But beneath his royal robes, the first red marks had already begun to rise, and above, the heavens stirred. Plague 8. Locusts, the swarm that devoured life. The skies over Egypt had barely cleared after the storm of hail and fire. People had just begun to gather what remained, a handful of scorched grain, a few grapes hanging on charred vines. In that fragile moment, it seemed life might begin again. A hot, dry gust blew in from the east, carrying the scent of scorched earth, and a strange, growing whisper. Not the rustle of leaves, but the tremble of millions of wings gathering in the distance. Locusts, they came not as insects, but as a cloud, not of rain, but of hunger. The sun disappeared behind their swarm. Darkness fell again at midday. They descended on fields, vineyards, and every green leaf that had survived the previous plagues. Within hours, all living vegetation was gone. No fire, no stone, just teeth. The locusts devoured what hail had spared. Their hunger was endless. Egyptians threw blankets over fields, waved their hands, lit fires, but every effort only enraged the swarm further. They looked upon their land, once fertile, once divine, and saw only barren dust where gardens once bloomed. Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, was now a grave of crops. Pharaoh panicked. He summoned Moses again. I have sinned. Pray to your God, end this curse. Moses agreed. The wind turned again, and the locusts vanished into the desert. But once the fear faded, Pharaoh hardened his heart again. What softness he had shown was drowned in pride. And Egypt, once the jewel of civilization, now stood as a bleeding wound beneath a darkening sky. And the next plague was waiting in the shadows. Plague 8. Hail and fire. Meteors from the sky. While Pharaoh still clenched his teeth, his skin blistered and weeping, the sky began to shift. Not in the way of seasons, but in the way of endings. The air thickened, heavy like a breath the heavens dared not exhale. Black clouds gathered on the horizon, dense, churning, cold like celestial serpents creeping across Egypt's rooftops. At the very moment Moses raised his hand to the sky, the wind rose, a slow, dreadful breath. Thunder cracked, not like any thunder they had known, but like the shattering of the heavens, howling like a god betrayed, and then it began. Hail. Cold, white stones the size of fists plummeted from the sky with the fury of meteors. They smashed rooftops, crushed fields, struck beasts and men alike. Never had Egypt seen the sky become a weapon. But that was not all. Amid the icy assault came streaks of fire. Lightning bolts, red and jagged, split the sky and crashed to earth like divine swords. Trees burst into flame. Crops turned to ash. People ran screaming. But there was nowhere safe. Life was crushed under hail, burned by flame, and drowned in terror. Pharaoh, for the first time, was silent. He stood at the palace balcony, once bathed in sun, now looking out upon an apocalypse where light was swallowed by ice and fire. Moses approached, calm. He gave no threat, no plea, only one final question. How long will you harden your heart? And Pharaoh, finally, begged, pray to your God, I will let you go. Moses nodded, and the storm ceased. But when the ground dry, when corpses were cleared, and fragile shoots dared rise from the ash, Pharaoh changed his mind, again. And somewhere, in the burning silence above, the next plague waited. Plague 9. Darkness falls, when the light is taken away. After the locusts were swept away by the hot desert wind, Egypt descended into a frightening silence. No bird sang, no children played, no plow stirred the earth, only a broken land, as if the soul of the kingdom had exhaled its last breath. Pharaoh remained defiant. He believed the nightmare had passed. But that was when the light began to vanish. There was no warning, no thunder, no storm. Just one morning, when the people of Egypt opened their eyes and saw nothing. The sky had collapsed, the sun, their most sacred god, worshipped for millennia, was gone. No clouds, no color, no heat, just a heavy, living darkness, thick as tar, clinging to walls, skin, and thought. It was not night, it was a sentient shadow, creeping into fingers and breath. People dared not move, for they couldn't see their own hands. Candles would not burn, fire gave no glow, everything was swallowed by an invisible abyss. 3 days, 3 nights, not a single ray of light. The Egyptians did not eat, they did not sleep, they barely breathed. They sat still, clutching their own bodies as though afraid their inner darkness might break free. Some went mad, others sat in silence, until they never rose again. But in the homes of the Hebrews there was light, not from oil or flame, but from fate, untouched by the plague. Once again, Moses stood before Pharaoh. He did not speak, the darkness spoke for him. And Pharaoh, no longer a king, but a broken man, sat trembling in blindness. Blind not only to the world around him, but to the truth before him. Yet still, he refused to let them go. This time, Moses said nothing, he simply turned away, because he knew the final plague was already at the door. Plague 10. The death of the firstborn, a night of mourning. After 3 days of darkness, Egypt believed it had reached the bottom. But we only know we've hit the bottom when there is nothing left to lose. And on that night, a night with no name, no moon, no breeze, Moses stepped out of the palace for the last time. He carried no staff, he issued no warning, only silence. And one final sentence, around midnight, the Lord will pass through Egypt. No one understood, but Moses did, and the Hebrews, following his instructions, painted lamb's blood upon their doors, a sign for the angel of death to pass over their homes. And then, midnight came. There was no thunder, no storm, only the soft breath of death, gliding silently through the streets that once teemed with life. No law could hold it, no prayer could stop it. When that darkness touched the firstborn, son or daughter, noble or slave, ceased to breathe. From Pharaoh's palace to the humblest hut, from stallion to cow, all firstborn lives were taken. It was not punishment, it was the final price of pride. The cries rose, all at once, a symphony of grief unlike anything the Nile had ever heard. Pharaoh, once defiant, once godlike, now held his son's lifeless body in his arms. For the first time, there was no rage, no pride, only emptiness. He stepped into the night, finding Moses not as a king, but as a grieving father. "Leave my land," he whispered, voice cracked with sorrow. "Take your people, take everything, just go." Moses said nothing. The Hebrews had been ready. They departed that night, without looking back. Behind them, Egypt was still weeping. And thus, a mighty empire fell, not by sword or fire, but by 10 refusals and 1 irreversible death. Conclusion: fate, nature, or a miracle? Egypt fell silent. The wrath of heaven and earth had passed, leaving behind a kingdom once towering like legend, now nothing but an echo scattered in the desert wind. And yet, the questions remain. After everything, what were the 10 plagues? Were they miracles, natural disasters, or a destined reckoning against pride? Generations have searched for answers. Scientists point to red algae, climate anomalies, disease outbreaks, and seismic events. Theologians speak of divine intervention. Astrologers see cosmic messages written in the stars. But perhaps the truth lies beyond any one explanation. Maybe it was a miracle, a perfectly timed chain of wonders meant to stir faith and awaken a nation. Or maybe it was nature, furious and unbound, punishing a system built on oppression and greed. Or perhaps, most hauntingly, it was fate, unraveling its silent thread, one plague at a time, while the world refused to listen. Pharaoh did not lose because Moses was stronger, he lost because he refused to stop. With every denial, he clung tighter to his crown instead of his people, to arrogance instead of humility. And in that defiance, he lost everything: the sun, the crops, the living, and finally, his future. Moses was no warrior, he wielded no sword. He carried only faith, and sometimes, faith alone can shift the course of history. The plagues are over, but the lesson endures. When nature quakes, when darkness falls, when the quiet cries of the oppressed are buried beneath the roar of power, will we recognize the warning before it's too late? Or will we, too, wait for the 10th plague,